All right, so in meditation 2, there's an important example that Descartes uses called the wax example. It shows up on the very bottom of page 537. And in meditation 2, he begins by recapping what had gone on in meditation 1. That is, he summarizes the fact that he was aware of nothing, he can be certain of nothing. However, as the meditation unfolds, he is led to the conclusion that while everything may in fact be deceiving him, and he can be sure of nothing, if he is being deceived, then his own thinking must exist. And so therefore you get the I think, therefore I am. Now, the Wags example comes in the wake of this logic. So if he's aware of his own thinking, and he does think of things, then those things presumably come from outside of himself. I mean, he says, I could be the author of some of them, but some of the things that come into our thinking, that come into our awareness, appear not to be put there by ourselves. So that would indicate that they come from elsewhere. So the question is, how is it and how is it and why is it that the images we get from our five senses come to us, and what are their nature? And so that's what the wax example is trying to show. And so what he says is, you take, this piece of wax. This is at the very bottom of 537, where he says, let us consider those things which are commonly believed to be most distinctly of all, namely the bodies we touch and see. Now, if you read that paragraph over, what he says is, so he's sitting at his desk, right? And so he gets a chunk of wax, and he says that it tastes of honey. So that's one characteristic about it. And then he says that it smells of flowers. Okay. Remember, this is wax from beeswax, not the Walmart fake chemical stuff. And it has a yellowish color to it. All right, and then it has a it's cool, and it's hard. You can rap on it and it emits a sound. Okay, so in other words, if you take all of these things here and you add them all up, you will get wax. I mean, the idea is you recognize things by their appearance, right? So, in other words, if you have all of this bunch of appearances, you assemble it all together, and then you assign the name wax because you recognize it based on its sensory experience. Good enough. Where it becomes a bit of an issue, however, is when he says you heat it up by the fire. So going down in that same paragraph, he says, but notice that as I'm speaking and bringing it close to the fire, the remaining traces of the honey flavor are disappearing, the scent is vanishing, color is changing. Okay. So in other words, as you heat the wax up, what happens to the taste? It becomes tasteless. What happens to the smell? It becomes odorless. What happens to the color? It becomes clear. It becomes hot. And it becomes liquid. So in other words, if you add up all of these things, you will get something very opposite to that. In fact, if you think about it, and this is the whole thing, if this is wax, right, here, because of all of these things, then this over here, which is the exact opposite of all those things, would have to be like non-wax. Because notice, right, the tremendous difference between these two worlds, right? You have sort of like A and B. And these are two completely different things in appearance. Think of it this way. If you recognize a Brussels sprout because you recognize its shape and its taste and its color and all that kind of stuff, you would not call that Brussels sprout a dump truck, because a dump truck would appear to you to look very different, to smell different. You know, maybe if you tasted it, you would also taste that it's very different. So we don't often think about this in everyday common speech, but what you call wax has nothing to do with your five senses, because this is wax and this is wax, yet these are absolute contradictions. So why is it that you would call that and that wax, but you wouldn't call a Brussels sprout and a dump truck the same thing? Well, consider this. If you take something like wax, right? Wax can be manifested in two totally different ways, A and B. Think also of something like water. Actually, water would be a simpler example for us, because water can be liquid, it can be ice, and it can be vapor, right? So it's the same kind of thing, right? You'd have like A, B, C. Same here. We would have, hot wax versus, cold wax, and they would appear very different. Okay, same sort of thing. So if you look kind of at this level, right, you pay attention to, this. What you get is a sense of things from your senses, and what it gives you are things like cold and hot and all that kind of stuff. The appearance, right? It gives you the appearance of things. But the funny thing is, of course, these appearances are contradictory. And if they're contradictory, that means you have to disclaim all this stuff as to what the thing is, right? Because again, if you're going to have contradictory information about something, then it can't tell you the nature of that thing if it's in contradiction, right? So then the question becomes, well, seriously, what is the wax? I mean, how do you know wax? Because you don't know it from your five senses. As an example, suppose I were to take something like this ice, and I give my dog an ice cube in the summertime, and she's all excited because she gets a treat. And what happens when she sets her treat down is that the ice becomes liquid. Now, my dog doesn't understand that the water and the ice are the same thing. My dog assumes that if the ice cube is gone, it's because somebody took it. And so she looks around for the ice cube, not understanding that it's melted. What she doesn't understand is liquid equals ice equals vapor, because she doesn't understand the nature of water. In the same way that when we pay attention to wax as people, we are not paying attention to the appearance of wax, but rather the nature of wax, if that kind of makes sense. Now, in terms of water, it would be easy if you said, well then seriously, what is water? Now, what he says on page 538, the paragraph that says perhaps the wax was what I now think it is, namely that the wax itself never really was the sweetness of honey, nor the fragrance of flowers, nor the whiteness, nor the shape, nor the sound, but instead was a body that a short time ago manifested itself to me in these ways, and now does so in other ways. But just what precisely is this thing that I thus imagined? Let us focus our attention on this and see what remains after we have removed everything that does not belong to the wax. Only that it is something extended, flexible, and mutable. Okay, so his point here, right, is he's saying, well, let's take away everything that does not belong to the wax. And by belong, he means this: cold. Is cold part of wax? Well, no, because it can also be hot, right? And then you could say, well, is the honey taste part of wax? Like, does it belong to it? Well, no, because the taste goes away. So in other words, all the things that you can sense about it are not in it. They do not belong to the wax. So what belongs to the wax? Extension. Oopsie. Flexibility. And mutability. So in other words, what the wax actually is, mutability, whoops, sorry guys. What the wax really is this. This is what the wax is, right here. And so what it's telling us ultimately is that it is a substance. And if you're thinking of Aristotle here, that's the way to go. Because the substance is extended, right? It occupies space, it is extended in space, it's flexible, so that the substance can take on these, various other kind of attributes, and it's mutable, and so it can change. That's what wax is right here. Just like water. If we say, well, what is it about the extension and flexibility and mutability of water? Ultimately, you'd come up with something like, H2O, because you could say, oh, well, if you have an atom thusly, right, an oxygen atom with 2 hydrogen atoms on it, right, bam, there's a water molecule. And then you understand if you string all these guys together, then it can take on these different properties down here depending on temperature and energy and all that kind of stuff. And what this is, here, when you go to a molecular theory, that is an extended, flexible, mutable substance. So, what is wax? This, not this. Now, the significance, however, is that our minds automatically go here. They don't stop here. This is the way dogs understand things. But this is the way that human beings understand them. And so his point is, whatever we're going to we're not sure what we're going to call this kind of knowing yet, but this kind of knowing is way different than this kind of knowing. And this kind of knowing will never give you the truth. Notice truth. The truth and certainty about something, because the truth and certainty about wax, what you can be sure of as wax is the extended, flexible, mutable nature, not whether it tastes of honey or doesn't taste of honey. Anyway, that's the wax example, and we'll come back and look at some of the significance and tie it all in the next couple of episodes.